Okay, I hope everybody can see this. And yeah, it's really nice to see so many old friends and names I've for a long time not encountered. So it's quite exciting, actually. And I want to start by thanking Sarah for inviting me and also for insisting that that I do something, because the topic should be urbanization in Iran. And as many of you know, I haven't been able to work in Iran since 2006 anymore. So I was wondering, what is there to say? Urbanization also brings me to the fourth millennium, of course, is when we see the first steps of this. And I was thinking, what could I contribute that I haven't said like a million times before? So for those of you who have heard me talk about the site of Arisman and the project on early copper metallurgy, I apologize in advance. You will know some of this. Nevertheless, I try to kind of give it a new angle. So for the title, I was actually at first thinking about copper and complexity, but of course this title has been taken by an article published by Roger Matthews and Hassan Fazeli in 2004. So I added the centralization to give it a new angle, and I will see if this, or you will see if this will work. And now, most of you will know that I have been working in the site of Arisman on the Central Plateau of Iran for several years in the early 2000s. This was part of a collaborative effort by the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization, the German Archaeological Institute, then also friends from the German Mining Museum, the Freiberg Technical University, and the Geological Survey of Iran. And before even starting, I just want to acknowledge that whatever work happened in the framework of this project goes back to all these long-standing by now relations and collaborations. So we worked there for a good 7 seasons. 5 of them we excavated, 1 we went for survey, 1 we went for just study work, and we published a monograph that details most of our results, which is the little red image you see on the lower left, which is the cover of the book on early mining and metallurgy on the Western Plateau. So thinking about what has happened since the book came out, I started to think, well, even though we haven't been in the field since, there have been a couple of important new developments, and I hope I can pay tribute to all the new work that's being done by contextualizing what we have been doing about 15 years ago in Arisman. First of all, there is new excavations happening. There was the Goli Darwish excavations, which have produced a sequence of important dates on the late 4th millennium. The discoveries in rescue work in the tepes of Shogali and Sofalin are important here. And there is a follow-up project now by Reinhard Bernbeck, Susan Pollock, and Morteza Hessary in the Varamin region, which also adds new detail. Another new discovery and continuous work now by Youssef Isoshk and his team is the excavations in Meymanabad, also in the suburbs of Tehran, and very distant, Hossein Azizi has investigated another late 4th millennium site in the northeast of Iran, in Kalekuk. So a lot of new fieldwork seems to be concentrating on the Iranian plateau. This is not really a surprise, because this is very closely linked to a lot of rescue work in this ever-growing suburbs of Tehran and surroundings, or the other big cities around. But then, as some prominent archaeologists, including Ernst Herzfeld, have said long ago, archaeology is more than excavating. Archaeology is also studying, refining, and going back to the lab. And so I want to draw your attention to this really important collection of individual contributions that Kamran Petri has brought together in the edited volume on ancient Iran and its neighbors, that kind of puts us on a trail of saying, well, here we are standing in 2013, where can we go from now? And there are other important publications like Philippe Bourgeas, Le Monde de l'Océan Indien, which are all different ways of interpreting at large, which is a different way of a large-scale interpretation of early economic relations. Then there have been quite a few efforts to draw new dating from ancient sites. So we have a couple of studies on radiocarbon dates from the Iranian plateau, most importantly by the Oxford lab and Mark Pollard, but also a few other sites like what John Alden has more recently published from Talekure, based on samples that have been exported several decades ago. And there have also been attempts now to look into the organization of craft, for example, by detailing pottery production, both in Banesh, in Godin Tepe, and in other sites that are of relevance to our period. So by looking at this, I thought there's enough that has happened to kind of maybe revisit our site of Arisman. And what I hope to do today is I will say really just a few words on how we approach the question of social complexity and what a study of copper working can tell us about this. I will then introduce in a summary version the results from the Arisman project, and I will in the next step then try to put them into the wider setting and to kind of confront it with all the evidence from the other new sites as far as this is possible at this very preliminary stage. So thinking that this is a seminar, I thought in the beginning I should treat you to a complete introduction of our approaches to the topic of social complexity. And then I decided to save you this because it's just going to be the topic for at least one individual lecture. When archaeologists talk about complexity, it's mostly because we kind of lack the more precise models that, that we might be needing to approach the question of how societies start to differentiate internally, how they start to divide not only resources, but also power, and how all this then develops into in a feedback process into ever more complex models. So complexity in a way is just a word that tries to grasp a concept that we try to be not too precise about because we are kind of lacking the individual vocabulary, at least in places. So you're all familiar with Gordon Childs' concept of an urban revolution, where we have a lot of different aspects that make this revolution happen, and where in particular the division of labor is an important aspect. We see in the 1960s some neo-evolutionary approaches of finding definitions for the levels of internal organization. Most famously, we have Elman Service's typology of social groups from a simple band to tribe and chiefdom and state. Many people very rapidly were not so happy with this model and voted for a more diverse typology in this. And with the keyword of heterarchy, we talk about the fact that there are numerous factions within one society that very often are not organized in a hierarchical way, but in a sort of equal parallel way. From the 1980s onwards, we see numerous approaches to enter center or to bring center periphery models into the discussion. And so I'm happy you're here, Guillermo. The Uruk world system is certainly, with regard to what happens on the Iranian highlands, one of the most influential approaches to talk about a center periphery model. And by and large, macroeconomy is at the basis of numerous other approaches. I quote here Blanton, Feynman, Earle for political economy at large. From the years 2000s onwards, we have different approaches that put individual agency at the forefront. So we talk about things like leadership strategies, etc. Nevertheless, at the level of resolution that we have for the Iranian plateau, I think the macroeconomy level is certainly the one that helps us most to get at least a first grip on where we stand. And just to recall, I have only 3 slides for these people. We talked about child's urban revolution, and we have the specialist laborers and the division of labor as one important aspect in it. I already mentioned the Uruk world system introduced by Guillermo Algaze, and Philippe Beaujar's study is another example of making the most of these complementary systems. And I quote this in particular because he introduces the idea that we also have a labor division at the level of, at a regional or intra-regional level, so that we would have different regions doing different parts of a divided system, which for him only happens, or according to him, only happens from the Iron Age onwards. And lastly, what I would call this is the periphery striking back. There are first efforts at defining how, for example, the production of copper in those areas where the copper is actually found, how this kind of counterbalances any centralized approaches to complexity. So this is the Copper and Complexity article that I mentioned in the beginning. And while all this theoretical, let's say, discussion was going on, we were already in the field by then. We were almost reaching the completion of the Arisman project, which had started in the field in the year 2000. And what we did there was an investigation of copper production. So what the one has to do with the other is something I hope that will become apparent over the course of this coming approximately an hour. Sarah was very generous in saying that I could very well talk for an hour, so I tried to keep this light nevertheless. What we did there was an approach to the copper industry that is basically we tried to reconstruct the complete process of copper working from the rock to the final product and to everything that happens in the society with it. So this approach, there are various parallel schools that approach the styles of technology or the way how technology is introduced and is practiced in a society. I refer usually to the French school introduced by Marcel Mauss and then refined by André Leroy-Gourand with respect to archaeological materials, which is the operational chain or chaîne opératoire, which kind of dissects the process of craft production into several steps. And these steps are all guided by both the material that's available, the product that should come out in the end, but a lot of considerations in between. One is the purpose of the product. One is also the skills of the craftsperson, and so on and so forth. So this approach, which goes really back to the 1930s, has been then refined by Barbara Ottaway for copper, because metal in general is considered to be a material that is never ending, which is in reality is not exactly true. So some material is always lost, but as metal is so very often reused and recycled, etc. So we don't have a linear model here. We rather do have a circle. And we see that there is all kinds of steps involved where we have a finished artifact down here, and this artifact goes into trade. It is then lost or it's buried. So wherever we are here, we have different considerations to take to understand what's happening. And I tried to, in this slide, I tried to make this a bit more visible. When we start from the rock to the extraction of ore and the extraction of the proper metal, we can then proceed towards making an object and then handling or trading the object until it's deposited or lost or recycled again. So we do have a circle, but we have a circle where all the time new material is entered. And if you look at this more closely, then we see that the larger part of this circle is really not visible to our eyes because either the objects do not survive, the mines are kind of negative evidence because they would be empty then eventually. So we rely on a lot of filters, on multiple filters really, to investigate copper metallurgy. And this means we will have to use a lot of ingenious procedure to extract meaning from the data. And this is where the German school comes in. I mean, Germans are very well known for not being very theoretical, but good engineers. And this is where I think the Arisman project can make a point in having this coherent and the attempt at least at a holistic interpretation. So we would have to use field evidence from the mines, from the working places, and from excavated evidence. We would have to combine this with metallography, isotopes, trace elements, and all kinds of evidence that makes a link between the mines and the objects. And we will have to enhance the whole picture by using indirect evidence, as I would call it, which would be imagery or text that adds a layer of information on metal working. That was the introduction. So this said, going now into the Arisman project, you can see that this is basically the list of goals we pursued in the greater project, which was called Early Mining and Metallurgy on the Central Iranian Plateau. And Arisman was only one part out of this. This was the site where ore was processed into objects. The German Mining Museum excavated mines in the Veshnove area close to Gom, and there were a lot of lab works also involved in the complete project, but we concentrated on excavating an archaeological site, and this is Arisman. So what you see here is a view onto the site, and in the background you have the Carcass Mountains. We had an elevation of approximately 1,000 meters above sea level. The mountains in the background, they don't seem so impressive, but they go up to 4,000 meters, the Carcass Mountains. And we are here in an area where we see these low elevations, that all of this is archaeology. And in the foreground, you can see that there is a number of, or there's the whole surface is strewn with slag fragments and pottery. So this is what the site looked like at the beginning, and this is taken during the first or second season. We then did whatever you need to do. Let me go back. So the site was chosen first, I have to say first this, because we are now located in a place where Iran is famous for being located here on the Tethyan-Eurasian metallogenic belt. So not all of Iran and not all of the highlands is a place where you find copper, but you find it along this very long folding zone of the inner Zagros and also along the Albos. And it is in this area south of Tehran, where here we have our site of Arisman, and we have a great number of known sites, Tepesiak, another known site. Veshnove is the mining site that was excavated. And to give you a scale, from Siak to Arisman, this is a good 60 kilometers only. And you see the very well-known and well-established mining district of Anarak at a distance of approximately 200 kilometers from where we are. So this was the reason to choose this place, which was also really a very large place, or it seemed like a very large place. To show you a close-up from Google Earth, you have the site of Arisman here located on a vast gravel fen coming down from these Carcass Mountains that you have seen in the background before. And you can also see that this is an ancient valley, and there is another just little mountain range, the Latif Mountains, where there's more gravel fens coming down. The two kind of connect here, forming a today very dry valley zone moving to the southeast. I also indicated this, the site of Holabad. Holabad is a major karstic spring, which is still active today. And I think it's important also to imagine that in the fourth millennium BC, we had a very different drainage system and water regime. And one reason why such an extensive site must have been here on the gravel fen must be linked to the fact that there was water available in the neighborhood. So another close-up, and you see how impressive this all this gravel fen is. The gravel fen also links me to one thing that we did not know when we started to work in Arisman, which is that there is still sometimes heavy rainfall in the mountains coming down in a sort of flash flood system. And I owe these images to Pejman Mazaheripur, who happened to visit the site after we had completed excavation, and who sent me these pictures saying, see, there is a real river here going over the site. And for me, that was a revelation, because I had been wondering when excavating on the site, how come that we have these enormous holes that are looking like this is a puddle, or that is a kind of river course running over this site, while standing literally in the middle of a gravel desert. So this was something that didn't make sense to me in the beginning, but after seeing these images, it did. And it also may explain a lot of what is missing at the site, because I'm now convinced that the erosion that took place due to not only wind, but also to these flash floods carried away at least a meter or two of cultural deposit. So the site of Arisman proper, this is a topographic map that I have shown before. I have now added a scale to make it clear that this is a really extensive site. This is half a kilometer, and between the individual zones that were investigated, between B and C in particular, which are the settlement areas, there is almost half a kilometer of distance. So even though we consider this to be one site, it must have been a site that was shifting in space and that has built up not a vertical stratigraphy as you would expect it, but that relocated every now and then by probably reacting to the availability of water. And I will introduce first these two areas, B and C, because they are prototypical for what we have for two distinct chronological periods, like the mid-4th millennium, and then what comes later in the so-called Proto-Elamite period. So I start with the older one, area B, where we opened 400 square meters in 4 trenches. And it turned out that over these 4 trenches, we encountered a solid 1 meter deposit of debris, of kind of industrial debris. There was a whole group of pottery kilns that had been dug into these levels, and we have from these levels a huge amount of industrial waste, so to say, and only below this 1 meter of industrial debris deposit do we have a first building complex, which is just a one-room building here with a kitchen area. And if you look at these vessels that were collected from the fireplace here, this is handmade cooking vessels. It has nothing to do with what we are familiar with from the so-called Sialk-3, the painted Sialk-3 materials. So this is representative of the older occupation in Arisman. In addition, so what you see here is what we can link with the pottery kilns in this industrial area. A huge number of these conical vessels with a dark brown paint on buff ground, but we also have in between a number of materials that link to what we would consider the Uruk, what kind of resembles Uruk ceramics. We have beveled rim bowls of a rather clumsy version here. We have the spouted jars, we have these little beakers, we have trays, and we have exactly one such token. All this goes with the older period. And from the waste, or from the industrial waste layer, we also found, we collected a lot of materials that is linked with copper working. And all this is, so to say, typical for the mid of the 4th millennium. We do have molds for casting ingots. We have molds for casting shaft hole axes. We have the bases of crucibles that are pierced. And then we have something that is not very attractive to the eye, but super exciting to metallurgists, which is leafage, or the residue of silver working. And finally, we also have a small amount of gold in this. So consider this to be typical for copper working at the end of the Sialk-3 period. However, we have, for none of this do we have any good workshop context also, because all this is from the industrial waste layer. If we now jump 400 meters to the northeast to area C, we see another domestic quarter, and this was better preserved insofar as we have faults that run up all the way to the surface. So jumping from B to C, here we do have exposed on almost 600 square meters, we do have a settlement of the late 4th millennium BC. And this settlement is very, very different from everything we know for the preceding period. We do have a sort of planned settlement here with an alley going through, and then there's houses to the left and to the right. There is standardized mud bricks used for these walls. And yeah, altogether we went down to, I can't say bedrock, but we went down to the native soil, which we reached at a maximum depth of 1.6 meters. But then, and this was also the reason for stopping there rather quickly, then when we were in this area, there was only 40 centimeters of cultural layer preserved at all. This is what brings me to this assumption that I think a lot of cultural layers really isn't preserved at all here. So the material that goes with this recalls some of what we have seen in the Sialk-3 levels. We do have beveled rim bowls, but these are different. They are more conical, more steep-sided. We do have these little beakers. We have spouted vessels of a specific type that we know from Sialk. Then we have painted nose-like jars, and we have these rather large storage vessels that served as burial vessels at the same time. So that would be the typical assemblage here. And one problem that we had, and because of this erosion, is that with conflation and with flooding, what we found in these individual rooms probably condensed whatever layers was there before into one single layer. So the heavy pottery was just lying in place. We have found fragments of storage jars, etc., just lying in the corner, but it could simply have eroded down from above. So we were not able here to do any differentiation of different phases according to pottery typology, etc. So this is more or less, in particular, is a domestic area, and it is with dismantling one building phase after the other that we were able to recognize how most of our copper producing, copper working, copper processing installations were constructed into these houses at a later stage. So mostly we see the reuse of these houses at the moment when the houses proper probably were already ruins, where there were no roofs on top, but the houses or the ruins of the houses provided shelter to the craftsmen. So we see that the individual, we see the doorways being blocked. We have large platforms with lots of copper drops on it here built into one of these rooms. We have other such installations that have been constructed inside the domestic area, and we have numerous materials like molds and crucibles, etc., that are also found here, but very often not in a workshop context. We see that the tools used for copper working are very similar to tools that you would expect in a normal household. So we have these millstones here, or saddle querns, that were used for the grinding of ores. And we have inside here, I'm not sure if you can see the color, but in here we have these green dots. It's all copper ore that we find inside the pores of these basalt slabs, for example. We also have numerous molds for casting ingots and for casting flat axes. So a very different type of axe is now used. And we have in the very upper part of what's left, or what was saved from erosion, we also have a heap of both stone tools for copper working and scrap metal that was certainly lying there for being recycled at one point. So we have this settlement with this very different layout, but most of what we can link to the copper working is at a slightly later stage, at the stage when these houses were abandoned. So scrap metal for recycling. We also have some burials that have been dug into the site at a later point, where there's also copper among the funerary gifts. And so in a similar way to what we've seen for area B, now molds for ingots, molds for axes, lithage continues, then we have crucibles. And all this probably also links to the fact that now a new technology had been developed for the smelting of the ores, and this was the construction of closed furnaces, that could be powered also by trapping the wind that came down from the Caucasus Mountains, and that allowed here for continuous smelting of copper ores in these constructions. We only found exactly one of these furnaces, and as you can see on this photograph, we have numerous layers of clay added, which so every single smelting process that took place in here and then collected the molten metal at the base. After every single process, this whole cover had to be renewed. So this was renewed, we could count it 33 times. but it's the only such installation that has survived, and most likely the other furnaces that we would expect here were completely dismantled or had to be broken to extract the molten material. So single houses, then we have the one or other burial versus the planned houses and burials in storage jars, and to confront the older and the later metallurgy. Here, the crucibles with the pierced feet and others that here they are fixed to the ground with a lump of clay added here. Different types of molds. What continues is the litharge from silver working. So we can very clearly distinguish these two lines of production. And when we then look at the dating of it, so I recalibrated the dating here, we can see a very clear distinction between the older area B and the area C. And I'm totally aware that we are in this tricky last 3 centuries of the 4th millennium with area C, where because of the plateau and the calibration curve, we are not exactly so confident about placing this. And we didn't have enough material to do more of a modeling according to phases. We had only very few samples from area C. And here they are put in order, but it would be better if we had more, which we have. So the lab work indicated some interesting observations. When we look at the artifacts, we see that the Arisman artifacts here all group very closely together. But when we look at the isotopes for the ores and for the ore deposits in the neighborhood that we know of, we see that at least 8 different sources were used to bring ore to Arisman for smelting, which is quite interesting because it shows us also that this is an organization of work that is far from centralized and focusing on one source. It is either smaller individual expeditions or people traveling to distant places. So we haven't got a good explanation for it, but it's certainly quite diverse. So drawing it together, we see the older crucible smelting here, these kind of crucibles, and the big double axis here. And in the later period, we have pit furnaces that are used for the melting of raw copper and then the casting. We have workshops in houses that are being reused, and we have different types of axes being produced. Now, how did the transition from the one to the other take place is one of the questions I've been struggling with ever since I worked at this site. And what I observe and what I maintain is that this change was a disruptive change. It was not a smooth transition. But, and this is a caveat, of course, knowing that we have a translocation of the settlement for almost half a kilometer, that we have a different way of building these houses and planning the settlement altogether. And then we have the introduction slightly later of a new smelting technology altogether. So there is so much change happening that it's a bit difficult to really say what kind of mechanism is behind. So to approach this a little further, I want to now take the older and the later period and confront this with the contemporary evidence. So if we look first at the older material, then we have, you have seen this already. This is the material we are searching for, and you find this immediately in the site of Tapegabrestan, which is a bit older than our area B in Arisman, but which has exactly the same type of crucible which also has molds for the casting of double axes, which has molds for multiple ingots, etc., and which is all very, very closely comparable. The second site that is closely comparable is, of course, our big neighbor, and that's Tapesialk. Roman Gierschmann had excavated the site of Tapesialk in the early 1930s and has then distinguished 6 major occupation periods. Out of these 6 periods, 3 and 4 cover the 4th millennium. And this is also our major point of reference here. So in Gierschmann's Big Trench 1, where he had a profile drawn that you should kind of project into where this gray square is sitting, you have a whole sequence of occupation layers or settlement layers. The blue ones here cover what he called then Sialk 3, which is characterized by buff ceramics with brown paint. Then there is there's a layer in between that is not very clear, another disruption in the sequence. And then you have a layer that he calls Sialk 4, which we also may call proto-elamite. And this is the later where the ceramic resembles what we find in our area C. So here we have in a vertical stratigraphy, we have exactly what in Arisman we have in a horizontally spread out system. And it is here the Sialk 3 painted material. And it is thanks to Pierre Amier, who revisited the field notes of Gierschmann and published in 1986 or 5 an article on the stratigraphy, that he could disentangle a few materials that are very close to key shapes of the Uruk canon here that also belong into the late Sialk 3 horizon. Jebrail Nokande, who I'm very glad to see that he's here today, he then returned together with Dr. Malek Shamirzadeh to the site in 2001 or 2002, and they cut back the old, what was left of the old Gierschmann profile, as you can see here. And they managed to reconnect this profile here with the profile that we know from Gierschmann, and to then bring together radiocarbon dates and typical material for all of this, which allows us now to place a few more, let's say, more robust dates to the sequence. And at the same time, during this Sialk reconsideration project that Dr. Malek had initiated, there was also large-scale work in one area that became known as the industrial quarter, where lots of copper slag was found, where also we have the same type of crucible. But we also, interestingly, find a cylinder seal here, and these clay cylinders that are necessary for keeping open a shaft hole in one of these cast shaft hole axes. So we see that Sialk basically had the same industry as Arisman had. Arisman was not at all so special here, but this is what all these sites along the Iranian Central Desert seem to have done back then. And the rescue works in the Varamin area by Morteza Heseri have also revealed some evidence for metal working. And I'm glad that Nima Nezafati is looking at this, who has had a close look at it, because there are installations really for the working of silver and for the so-called cupellation process that seems to date also to the late Sialk 3 period. So all this very nicely comes together here. And if you look at it on the map, we have Arisman, Sialk, Sofalin and Shogali here closely together, Gabrestan, These are the sites where we do find cupellation, where we do find shaft hole access, where we do find the same type of crucible, etc. And when we look at shaft hole access in total, and these are really very massive instruments, and they have been excavated in large numbers in the famous cemetery of Susa, then we see that probably there is a system in place already in the mid-4th millennium where a production taking place in the highlands is transported to the lowlands. And the recently found really fantastic cemetery of Toleshoga Sofla is another place where such copper products were consumed. And I just show here one flat X of a type where we also have in Arisman the molds coming with it that Abbas Moghadam recently published. So we could say that we have a consumer region down here. And if we connect this with other materials traveling, then we can see that this early copper trading here seems to happen within the context of some very actively competing elites forming a network of, where all these prestigious materials were traveling. So on the left, just to show this with a bit more detail, the site of Tel Brak is very well known as one of the early urban sites of the 4th millennium. We see here the accumulation, the hoarding really of prestigious materials. We also have at the same site evidence of some very, very strong interpersonal violence taking place. So if we talk about competition of the one or other form, we are certainly not wrong in also bringing conflict into the picture. Here in the north of the Southern Caucasus, we see these images here, and we have in Sechgerdan also, we do have these stone scepters with horse heads that are better known from the side of the north of the Caucasus, but which is also an elite behavior. And then what I have already shown, the use of copper here in the Susa and the Chogasofla cemetery. While on the highlands proper, we just have a few items of administrative or authentication objects. Now, going to the second period, what in Iran is mostly called the Proto-Elamite period, and which is represented in our area C. Here, area C. Area A is then the slag heap with the furnace that I had shown before. So you can see that the slag heap is just a little bit maybe later than the first occupation of area C. But we do have a continuous development here into the early 3rd millennium before the site then ends without seeing any later occupation. So just to recall here, the furnace in slag heap A. And there we have this massive, this is about 10-fold production of copper slag, at least, that we see during this period when compared to the earlier. So in Tepe Sialk, we would have then what's called Sialk 4. We have a bit of architecture published here. We see the same type of storage vessels for burials that we also have in the Arisman cemetery. We see in the very end then the use of administrative materials, including the so-called Proto-Elamite tablet that was found here, and a number of cylinder seals. And we have dates from the work of Dr. Malek and Jebrail Nokande, radiocarbon dates that allow us here to see that Sialk 4 and Arisman C are pretty much going in lockstep here. The last centuries of the 4th millennium then also see other sites with some very interesting finds that closely parallel what we find in Arisman C. Most importantly, Tapegoli Darwish, and on the outskirts of Gom, where we have a rather small, narrow stripe excavated, but a sequence of 4 layers, 2, 5, 4, 3, and 2, that all belong into these last 2 centuries of the 4th millennium, where we do have evidence for copper working, some copper slag, we have a mold and objects. And on the right, you also see that this comes with administrative material and with pottery that's typical for the Proto-Elamite period. So if you then look at the Arisman flat axes that I have introduced, then we see that these flat axes, we do not find them in Susa. We find flat axes there, but they are of a different shape. This very shape here is one that we find through the Piedmont zone, through the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. We have examples from cemeteries in Ahmed al-Hattu and Khayd Qasim in the Hamrin. We have them in Tel Guba, and we have them all the way to the Euphrates at the site of Haseköyük. So it seems that there's now a very different network in place along which these kind of axes travel. And there are other materials traveling. We have seen that silver has been produced in Arisman over time, and we have this very exquisite pendant here made in silver with inlays of various materials, including gold, foil. And we see in Susa, this is from Susa, this is from Susa, this is from Sialk, and this, it's not very beautiful as a drawing, but it's another such pendant from the Kunji cave in Khorramabad. So all these prestigious materials seem to be traveling in this smaller area. And the fact that we excavated 3 cylinder seals in Arisman, probably all coming from late area C burials, also sits nicely in the model that Holly Pittman has once published, or that she has once formulated about the Piedmont zone as a large interaction sphere where this glyptic material is traveling. So we see that there's a major shift in the orientation between the 2 periods. And I felt I now need also to, do I have time? I should hurry up. So thinking about centrality, I talked about complexity briefly. I did not yet introduce the notion of centrality, but I think what happens when this culture change between our area B and C takes place is that we also see a very different settlement pattern altogether. If we are looking at, if we go from, let's say, ideal versions of central place theory, such as they have been in a more mechanistic way been formulated in the first half of the 20th century by Kristalla and others, we wonder if such a model could ever apply on the Iranian highlands. And my answer is no, they can't. Because what we have in our survey data is a very revealing pattern. Within the context of the Arisman work, we did intensive walking survey in the whole region. And we found in this area, so we did a lot of walking here, also here on the outskirts of the current vegetation zone, and then on the way to where today is really the desert. What we found was that the Sialk 3 period, the period with the painted wares, is one where we find numerous smaller settlements here and there forming small mounds. And this is more or less spaced out in the landscape. But when we come to the Proto-Elamite period, to our area C, then we only have exactly one site, and that is Arisman, and the whole hinterland seems to be empty. So we observe something like a sucking up, like an absorbing of of the small settlements, and it is just one central site at this moment. And a similar, even though less strict pattern, I would say, is visible in the Kur River basin. But John, if you disagree, we can discuss this maybe at the end of this lecture. There seems to be an idea that, or there seems to be a pattern that these things kind of draw together. They absorb their hinterland. And now Jason Uhr, who has spent the last almost 15 years or so in studying urbanization in northern Mesopotamia, he has repeatedly pointed out how the early sites in northern Mesopotamia, and I take here the example of Tel Brak from one of his recent publications, where we also do not have this hierarchization of settlements, but we have a sort of coalescing of smaller individual units into one major center. It is also clear from work by Margarethe van Es in the greater Uruk area that Uruk also is not something like one center, but is something that grows together from a lot of smaller places. So this is a pattern that in this way would not apply to our area, but we see also that, let's say, the carrying capacity where we are located on today, the edge of the desert, has been such that settlements in this area never grew so large. So I would say centralization is a phenomenon we observe for a small or for a short period, which is also then not maintained over very long. If urbanization then is a matter of scale was a question I wanted to look into, and I then tried to bring together a few published layouts of sites to see if really what we find on the plateau is so much smaller than what we know from the lowlands. So looking into the late CR3 period, we have two published plans. One is the very well-known oval from Godin Tepe 6. And I tried to bring them all roughly to scale. So we have here this central house of Godin Tepe. We have the enclosure around. And if we compare with the recently exposed building dating to the late CR3 period in Meymanat-Abad, the site excavated by Ruhollah Yousefi Zoshk and his team, then we see that we do have really big buildings on the plateau. And if we look at the next period when we are in Arisman Sea, Goli Darwish, as I said, is only a very narrow stripe. And if we compare this to Malian ABC area or Yahya 4C, then these are all pretty much, I would say, homogeneous. There's nothing like here's a big, a really big building and here's small buildings, but we see differences in the quality of the walls. We see differences in how strong and thick these walls are. But if you look at all of these together, there is a lot of standardization visible. So wrapping this up, I think we can say there is a radical change happening when we enter the second half of the fourth millennium. We see in the older period dispersed settlements, there is a differentiation in size, but not too much. It seems to be not centralized, even though the metallurgy proper, as a sort of network of craftsmen, follows a pretty uniform protocol. The production, nevertheless, seems to be small scale and individual. All this takes place within the framework of competing elite networks that would also be, of course, the very vectors of information transfer. And then we probably find a few sites located in strategic locations, such as Godin Tepe on the Kangawa Valley, that can act as gatekeepers and thus gain a certain status from this. When we move on to the second half of the fourth millennium, we see that there are shifts in settlement locations in many places, and this has recently also been pointed out by Reinhard Bernbeck and Susan Pollock, Mortiza Hessery for the Varamin area. There is a shift in locations. Building traditions and craft traditions across the highlands appear to be more standardized, but the settlements proper, they seem to grow at the expense of the small settlements, and they start to absorb the village populations altogether. Yeah, there's a high degree of standardization, both in ceramics, in building, and in craft production. And the production of copper in itself has increased immensely to approximately 10 times what it was before. So here are the changes. They would also bring new problems with them. So if we do have early urban centers, how were they organized? We do not know of anything like a central building that we could connect with a central power or anything. How would such settlements be sustained? How would the water be allocated? How would the resources be distributed? How would the hinterland collaborate with the central place? So I think it will be important for new projects to look not only at the individual site, but at the surrounding areas just as well. And when revisiting the literature, I also want to point out that I always have the feeling that there is a bit of a selective preference in what's being published and what not, and that things we recognize because we have seen them somewhere else tend to get into the record more easily than others. I complete this very long overview by just pointing out what Philippe Bourgeat has written in his major book here on the Indian Ocean world systems evolution or development, because he claims that an interregional division of labor should only take place from the Iron Age onwards. If we look at how the consumption of copper happens in the lowlands, and we look at Uruk here, we see that copper plays an enormous role to adorn the temples, or also to produce all kinds of prestige items. So we are here now in the period that is coeval or contemporary to our area C. And it is most likely that there were also workshops in the lowlands. But as we know from the standard list of professions, there are a number of different smiths or different specializations of metal workers that work on metal, and that I thought I had a translation somewhere. So there are some that are the accountants of the smiths, and then there are the smiths proper. But all the work that happens on extracting the ores and also the refining of the ores is not represented in this list of professions. So we have the refinement and then the consumption here in the lowlands, but we do not have the first steps. And this brings me to this conclusion that we do have indeed an inter-regional division of labor already taking place here in the fourth millennium BC that is not maintained over the long run, because the proto-Elamite settlements in the highlands end eventually, and it's not quite clear how this continues. But we see here shortly before the year 3000, we see this division between the highlands and the lowlands. So this was a very long tour through revisiting some old evidence, which has, of course, a lot of hands behind the field work and also behind the subsequent lab work and publication, etc. I want to thank everybody who has supported the project, and I want to thank you for your patience. Thank you.